Suddenly, a knock echoed through the apartment like thunder. It seemed someone was in trouble, as it was the local sheriff, and he had come to someone's home. The thing is, the person inside had no way out. They were essentially trapped. However, no one opened the door, and the sheriff, along with his deputies, began to get seriously frustrated. But inside the apartment, it seemed no one was planning to answer as a dead girl lay on the bed. Next to her stood her killer, staring straight at her face, feeling the pounding and noise outside his door. The worst part was that he had tortured her. Her hands were in handcuffs and there were clear signs of violence. She had died a horrific death. Yet, the likely murderer didn't budge an inch, continuing to stand before his victim, holding the murder weapon in his hands. Meanwhile, the police, led by the sheriff, realized that no one was going to open the door, so they decided to break in at any cost. They tried to open the door with a rope, and after several failed attempts, they finally succeeded. In that instant, the officers burst into the apartment, weapons drawn and ready for anything. At the same time, the killer, hearing someone enter his home, prepared for an unexpected encounter with unwanted guests. It seemed he was pleased, as it became clear that his list could soon include new victims. As the killer saw the sheriff, he prepared to strike and finish him off, but something strange caught his attention, making him stop. A gun pointed directly at him kept him frozen in place. The thief couldn't believe his eyes when he realized a man was standing right outside his window, aiming straight at him. At that moment, the barrel of the police officer's gun was pressed against his head, which terrified the criminal. It was clear that the man, named Tozawa Kiichi, had no way out as armed men surrounded him from all sides, clearly determined. He was accused of drug possession, rape, and murder, and it was obvious that a harsh punishment awaited him. Meanwhile, the unknown person who had caught the thief off guard simply left the crime scene after doing his job. After a while, police cars arrived at the crime scene, and the area was cordoned off to prevent any civilians from entering. In the meantime, the thief was already sitting in handcuffs in a police car while the sheriff ordered the young man sitting next to the criminal not to touch him. It became clear that the sheriff had urgent matters to attend to, and the boy, named Sakaki, was forced to stay alone with Tozawa Kiichi. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed the criminal felt very nervous next to Sakaki. The criminal wouldn't stop, constantly repeating that he knew something. It seemed he had uncovered a terrible secret or realized something horrifying. Suddenly, Sakaki elbowed the criminal right in the face. It was so quick and unexpected that Tozawa Kiichi didn't have time to process what was happening and just stared at the boy in shock. However, that wasn't the end. Sakaki wasn't planning to stop. On the contrary, a joyful smile appeared on his face. It was clear he was enjoying what he was doing. For Sakaki, it was an easy victory, as after a while, his helpless opponent sat there, drained and bleeding. Tozawa Kiichi was furious at the boy for hitting him, convinced that real police officers wouldn't allow such a thing. But the thief's words had no effect, as the boy was convinced that his actions were entirely justified. He had committed a very serious and brutal crime, and he didn't deserve to be called a human being. Meanwhile, events shifted to another location. It became clear that one murder was not the end. Nothing foreshadowed disaster in the city park, and no one could have imagined that such a horrific tragedy could occur in such a beautiful place. Especially not the police officer who hurried to work every morning along the same route, greeting people who were simply out for a stroll. However, that morning was different. His attention was drawn to a strange noise coming from the bushes nearby. The noise was so loud and incomprehensible that the man had to stop and carefully survey the area around him. Yet, he noticed nothing and was about to head back when the strange sounds grew even louder and more distinct. This unsettled the man, so he decided to investigate what was really happening. Leaving his bicycle behind, he took another careful look around, but again saw nothing. The only thing left for the officer was to walk toward the source of the noise and check it out for himself, which he decided to do at that moment. However, the sight he saw behind the bushes terrified him to death. The man couldn't move for a long time. It seemed the officer's day was ruined, as he had found the body of a new victim. The morning at the office began as usual, despite a series of mysterious murders that had occurred the day before. For Sakaki, it was just another workday, as such events happened all the time, and it was part of his job. He had no idea what horrific things were about to unfold, but as per the customs of his job, he needed to conduct an investigation and determine the cause of death. His colleague urgently called a meeting, which was unexpected since it was very early and the circumstances of the crime were still unclear. But the boy paid no attention to his colleague's words, thinking it could wait, as he had much more important matters to attend to. However, the man called him by name again and Sakaki was forced to stop. From the officer's words, it became clear that they were dealing with more than just an ordinary serial killer. This was a true horror show. Meanwhile, an emergency meeting was being prepared in the office, where everyone would discuss the recent events and decide what to do next. In the meantime, the body of the young girl was delivered to the homicide department to determine the cause of death and other important details. It became clear that the girl was very young. Her name was Wajima Reiko. She was only 20 and was a sophomore at Sejin University. After a while, the meeting began, gathering influential experts. It turned out that the girl had gone missing 2 weeks ago, and her body was only found by chance that day. The estimated time of death was around 1 in the morning due to significant blood loss from large and deep wounds inflicted on various parts of her body. It was also revealed that the killer likely used a sharp blade to cut his victim, and all the injuries varied in severity. Therefore, investigators concluded that the murder weapon was a razor-sharp blade, which the killer probably used to kill all his victims. According to the medical examination, the woman had her breasts cut off with some sharp blade, after which she remained alive and continued to be tortured. However, this version seemed so absurd that the investigators simply couldn't believe it. Almost none of them had ever encountered anything like this. Moreover, in such a state, the girl continued to live and bleed for several hours while she was tortured and tormented. This was indicated by the estimated time of death and the injuries inflicted on her. Further details of the crime began to emerge, revealing that the woman had her skin removed from her abdomen all the way to her thighs. This news left everyone in shock. It seemed only Sakaki was behaving completely unfazed and nothing could scare him. Additionally, her body was completely covered in some unknown substance. Investigators had not yet managed to determine its origin or the approximate time it was on the dead girl's body, so they didn't know if she had been covered in it while still alive. But all the evidence pointed to the liquid possibly being ordinary red wine. Such an action by the killer could only be linked to some hidden motive or secret message. Yet, no one could come up with any logical conclusion. It was very hard to connect the amputated body parts and the wine. However, a man named Karasuma seemed to have an idea as he pondered and began to recall something. He started to remember all past investigations and tried to find similar details, especially involving wine or other alcoholic beverages. Eventually, he recalled that a month ago, a colleague from their office had been murdered in a similar manner. Additionally, in 1984, there was a double murder in Oita Prefecture and a robbery with murder in Shizuoka. The investigators hoped that these events might be connected and this could lead them to the probable killer. The man who made such a conclusion was a true fanatic of his work, and it seemed his colleagues envied his phenomenal memory. That man had solved many cases thanks to his talent, and he took each new investigation as a real challenge. He ordered a girl named Tamaki to check all surveillance cameras and track any suspicious activity from recent times. The girl, trusting the words of the experienced detective, immediately began to carry out his order without further questions. He instructed Sakaki and Mr. Shige to carefully examine the entire area in hopes of finding additional evidence. The man had a logical conclusion that the murders could be connected and that they might have been committed by the same thief. Moreover, he believed that the case they were trying to solve could be precisely for the homicide department. Meanwhile, the city continued to live its life. Shops were open and people were going to work. However, a woman who usually worked as a cashier reported that her register was free. At that moment, an unknown man approached her who looked, as she thought, very strange. Could this be the same man involved in all the murders? After all, among his purchases was only wine. Or maybe he was just an ordinary person preparing for a celebration. Outside the office, work continued to bustle. Following his partner's orders, Sakaki began to search the area while also questioning witnesses about the circumstances of the crime. The first people he encountered were two women who began to talk about an unusual person who stood out from the crowd and behaved very strangely. Furthermore, it became clear that this person had been present at a picnic that took place the day before the tragedy where he had stood out and was the real star. However, the police officer knew nothing about any picnics or other events that might have occurred the day before. This greatly surprised the girls as the program they were talking about was very popular and well-known. The thing was, the program they mentioned helped process videos and upload them online. It became clear that they were talking about the girl who had been brutally murdered. She had a very handsome boyfriend and about 50,000 followers. However, Sakaki began to realize that this wouldn't advance the case or bring him closer to the probable killer. So, The man thanked the women for the dubious information they provided and was about to leave. But suddenly behind him appeared Shige, who seemed to have started looking for him as he was also busy searching for evidence at the crime scene and questioning potential witnesses. It became clear that he had managed to find the boyfriend of the deceased girl, who worked at a cafe nearby. Therefore, without wasting a moment, the men headed straight to that cafe to talk to the guy. Just at that moment when they arrived, a young man was standing outside the establishment, taking a break. They were lucky as it was the victim's boyfriend, and unexpectedly for themselves, they managed to find him very easily. The men began to talk and were about to ask the guy a few questions to understand if he was involved in the murder. After expressing their condolences, they started asking how long he had been in a relationship with the deceased Wajima Reiko. However, as it became clear from the boy's words, they hadn't seen each other for a long time, which seemed to upset him greatly. When Shige heard that the guy hadn't seen her in a long time, he was very surprised as it contradicted the idea that he was involved in the murder. At that moment, the boy continued to say that he was just busy as he spent all his free time studying and working. But it seemed he sounded completely unconvincing as Shige didn't stop and continued to ask a whole bunch of questions. However, the young man replied that they hadn't felt like a couple for a long time and that their relationship needed a break, which they both wanted. But the police officer continued his interrogation and even tried to encourage the young guy. Meanwhile, Sakaki stood silently assessing the situation without saying a word. It seemed a logical conclusion to their conversation had come, and the police officer asked directly about the circumstances of the horrific murder. But unexpectedly for Shige, the boy agreed and began to tell the men what he knew. However, when the conversation ended and the police left the young man, it became clear that his story was dubious and he might be hiding something. At the same time, Sakaki paid no attention to the boy's words, so he didn't feel that he hadn't been told everything. Shige, on the contrary, was certain that they hadn't been told the most important details and that they would have to uncover the intrigue on their own. The thing was, about a month ago, that boy had quarreled with the victim over suspicions of infidelity. He learned this information from one of her friends. Sakaki continued to remain unfazed. It seemed he didn't care about the murder, and even such a brutal situation couldn't rattle him. Meanwhile, another police officer seemed deeply affected by what had happened. He was convinced that something like this would never happen to him. However, it is well known that such crimes could happen at any age or period. After a while, the workday at the cafe where the boy worked ended and he was about to go home. However, he was noticed by an unknown person. Suddenly, a heavy downpour began and everyone with an umbrella quickly sought shelter under it. But the unknown person was not deterred at all. He continued to follow the boy and didn't fall behind. It became clear that the boy was not just a witness but already a potential suspect, and it seemed big problems awaited him. Meanwhile, the unknown man in his apartment was reading the news, trying to find some interesting information. However, what he actually saw was simply unbelievable. Moreover, countless people across the country could watch what was happening. It seemed the news was truly sensational as real horror and despair were evident on their faces. As it turned out, this was a new victim of some terrible serial killer, and next to her stood a bottle of wine, confirming this theory. In the police office, where the investigation into the 2 previous murders was ongoing, they were also aware and had already begun gathering materials regarding the new incident. At that moment, a new letter arrived from the department, which was very urgent, indicating confirmation of what had happened. Upon opening the letter, the people saw a simple link without any additional information. Obviously, it was a link to a live broadcast that had started about half an hour ago. From the title, it became clear that this was the next victim who was likely still alive. And judging by everything, the murder was about to happen live. Everything looked so horrific that one might think it was just a regular recording. However, there was evidence indicating that everything was happening live. It looked like a real factory, but the police didn't immediately notice one important detail. This detail had one common feature for all the murders that had occurred recently. And yes, it was the same wine that the killer used as his signature, leaving a trace of himself in this way. When the people realized it was indeed wine, they understood that one person was behind this, or the murders were clearly planned, and those who committed them were working toward a single goal. It seemed even this news didn't rattle Sakaki, as he remained completely unfazed. Meanwhile, the pursuit of the boy continued and the unknown man followed him all the way home. When there was no one around to see them and the boy stopped, the unknown man in a hood approached closer and touched him. The boy felt a heavy hand on him and decided to turn around to check what was really happening. His surprise knew no bounds when he saw the exhausted mother of his girlfriend in front of him. Immediately, She grabbed him with both hands and squeezed so tightly that it genuinely frightened the boy. The woman didn't stop and kept asking him why her girl had died. Did she also think he was involved in such a terrible tragedy? She looked the boy straight in the eyes, waiting for an explanation from him. However, he coldly replied that he knew nothing and couldn't help in any way. Hearing this, the woman's heart broke. In despair, her legs gave way, and unable to stand any longer, she fell to her knees in front of the young man, to which he replied that he couldn't help her and, even more so, couldn't save or protect her. Meanwhile, in the office, all the police officers were glued to the live broadcast. Suddenly, scissors appeared on screen and it became clear that horrific torture was about to begin. At that moment, people leaned in closer, trying to catch any details that could help piece together the crime. However, the scissors didn't linger long in the frame. The killer briefly showcased them like a trophy. Then, a message popped up for the viewers where the killer invited everyone to witness the suffering of his new victim. The officers collectively recoiled from the monitor. Even Sakaki, who had been stoic until now, started to visibly fidget. The new message on the screen stated that the unknown assailant would first cut off the girl's nose and then her legs. Soon after, the killer himself appeared on screen. He began to approach the girl, and once he was right up against her, he stopped. The image sharpened, and a zoom feature clearly revealed the girl's face. Shige looked particularly shaken as he recognized the girl's face from somewhere. Others hurried to scrutinize her features, trying to create a mental portrait of her. It seemed like no one could comprehend what was happening. They could only watch in horror as events unfolded. Suddenly, Shige shouted with a look of terror on his face. He recognized the girl and was certain he had seen her just the day before. In an instant, the victim began to suffer, as the killer slowly started to cut off her nose with the scissors. The screams of the victim were clearly audible in the live broadcast. It was so horrifying that even the investigators, who regularly dealt with murders and investigations, couldn't bear to watch. Moreover, they ordered an immediate effort to stop the broadcast and erase it entirely. Meanwhile, the viewers of the stream were in disbelief. Many thought it could just be a poorly executed prank. After all, it was hard to believe that something like this could actually happen. Additionally, the killer continued to post messages in the chat, threatening that this was just the beginning. As before, the torment of the poor girl continued and she kept screaming and begging for help. Sakaki understood that the killer was a true psychopath and extremely dangerous, especially if he was bold enough to film his actions and broadcast them. Meanwhile, the horrifying stream continued and people watched in real time as the nightmare unfolded. The monster kept torturing his victim while she was still conscious. The tip of the unfortunate girl's nose lay on the ground, alongside the circular scissors. The killer's breathing was labored and it seemed he was deriving pleasure from what he was doing. At the same time, the investigators decided to start searching for the girl and the killer. They hoped they could still save her. They managed to trace the signal source and, gathering their strength, headed to the crime scene. Upon entering, they had to use flashlights as it was so dark inside that they couldn't see anything. The first thing they saw was a massive pool of blood spreading across the floor. Sakaki, Shige, and the soldiers began to approach the spot where the crime had been committed on the broadcast. In the darkness, they found traces of blood and items that could have been used to torture the girl. After a while, right in front of them, the men encountered such a horrific sight that it made them stop in their tracks. For there, right in front of them, lay the same girl, now without a nose, and it seemed they were too late as she was already dead. Additionally, she had her legs severed, which lay on the ground next to her. The police hadn't expected the victim to be missing her legs as they hadn't seen the full horror that had unfolded in the live broadcast. A person capable of such a heinous crime was a true psychopath and didn't deserve to live in society. The next day, it rained as if symbolizing the terrible tragedy that had occurred the day before. Shige continued to walk the streets, interviewing people in hopes of finding witnesses or anyone who might know details about the murder. He managed to talk to a huge number of people, but no one knew anything. His partner was also busy interrogating and searching for witnesses. As expected, this yielded no results, as there were no cameras within a 500-meter radius. Thus, despite all the efforts the police made to find witnesses, they came up empty. But they understood that it was because of them that the woman who had told them about the victim's boyfriend the day before had been killed. The situation was quite dire, but the men had no choice but to head back to the campus, hoping to uncover new details. So, without wasting any time, they headed to their office to discuss with their colleagues. Shige knew he had to crack this case somehow, or he risked losing his job. After a while, the guys reached the office where they immediately began discussing the details of the murder. They hoped that someone among their colleagues had found some information, but it was clear that all the crimes shared a common detail. It was about the university, and although this detail seemed trivial, it was something they noticed. Karasuma concluded that the university could connect the 3 girls who studied there. They were all participants in a beauty contest that had taken place the day before. However, Shige found this theory somewhat absurd as he had no idea how to connect the dots. But at that moment, it became clear that 3 students had simultaneously made it to the finals, and this detail linked them together. Tagawa Haruka and Wajima Reiko were participants and competitors in the beauty contest. Moreover, these girls soon became victims of one of the serial killers. This incredible detail sparked a real frenzy and shock on the faces of the police as they realized they were likely dealing with a true serial maniac. Furthermore, the victims had body parts removed. One girl had her breasts cut off, while the others lost their noses and legs. Flipping through the portfolio of one of the victims, it became clear that she was indeed a talented and beautiful student. But why did the maniac choose them? What could these girls have possibly done to deserve this? Moreover, he acted with extreme cruelty and resorted to horrific torture. Also, considering there were 3 girls, it was entirely possible that a 3rd murder could happen soon. Therefore, to prevent the killer, they needed to contact the authorities and request a guard for the 3rd student. They also needed to find out about anyone who had been in contact with her. Additionally, they needed to request information about the user who was streaming and find a way to stop him and catch the criminal. Suddenly, someone burst into the office, shouting for the director. It was Aoi, and he seemed very flustered and scared. However, it turned out he brought good news as it was revealed that fingerprints had been found at the crime scene. The suspect was Shigeyama Ryuichi, who was already in prison for drug possession. After a while, the investigators set off to a new location to investigate the shocking murder further. Sakaki hoped they had finally gotten closer to solving the case and found the first pieces of evidence. However, it seemed he understood that this case was the toughest he had ever faced. Additionally, other police officers arrived to assist with the investigation, and together they decided what to do next. Sakaki and Aoi planned to enter the building through the main entrance. Karasuma, who also arrived to investigate the circumstances of the crime, was to enter through the back. Shige decided to stay by the car and keep an eye on the building to ensure no one entered or exited. However, his partners thought even this task might be too much for him. The man himself was convinced he had the easiest job, as he wasn't putting himself in danger or risking his life. Clearly, none of the men noticed a small detail in the house, an open window. It seemed unremarkable except for the shadowy figure that was constantly watching the men from that window. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Seija University. A student named Matsui was rushing to class when suddenly someone called her name. Hearing her name, the girl had no choice but to turn around and see who it could be. Meanwhile, Sakaki and Oi reached the building and prepared to enter through the main entrance. Karasuma was also on site and getting ready to go in, while the officer who stayed outside was watching everything closely. Sakaki had the key which he planned to use to get inside. So, when everything was ready, he cautiously began to open the door, bracing for the worst. As it turned out, the inside was a complete mess, and it felt like no one had lived there for ages. However, that wasn't the case, and they were heard by a man who looked far from friendly and seemed unhappy to see guests. He was completely raw and prepared for a confrontation. After a while, the man managed to open the door. Armed, he and his partner prepared to quietly enter, trying not to attract attention. Upon opening the door, they were met with the horror that lay inside. The stench in the apartment was unbearable. But they had no choice but to go in, as they suspected they weren't alone. Sakaki knew that besides him and his partner, Shigeyama was also inside, who was likely one of the suspects. However, as they moved through the apartment, they couldn't find anyone, and it felt like they were walking into a trap. But the men weren't about to give up easily and continued to navigate the apartment despite their fear and doubts. Moreover, they had to be very careful as tons of trash could give them away and the perpetrator might hear them. And so, it seemed the guys had nearly searched the entire place without finding the suspect. But hope remained as there was still one last room left, which was piled high with garbage. The tension was so thick that Sakaki ordered Aoi to stop to decide what to do next. The expression on the unfortunate guy's face showed fear, and it was clear how much he dreaded this daunting task. Next, to avoid drawing attention and making noise, Sakaki decided to go in alone. Suddenly right in front of him he saw the very suspect who was screaming and holding a knife. Without thinking, he lunged at the men, attempting to stab them. At that moment, he was so close that it seemed with one swipe of the knife he could easily take their lives. However, Sakaki didn't see it that way and appeared completely unfazed. At the last moment, he managed to dodge the attack and remained unscathed. Moreover, he wasn't about to let the attacker go, so he used his own weapon against him. 2 precise shots struck the man right in the legs, incapacitating him but not causing serious injuries. With terrifying screams, he fell to the ground, dropping his weapon. It was clear that the fight was over for the assailant, as he couldn't resist, especially after taking a kick to the face. Sakaki calmly and coldly dealt with his opponent, but the man didn't want to give up easily and still tried to resist, to which the boy just smiled and mocked him. Aoi, who was witnessing the incredible duel, was impressed by his partner's professionalism and composure. Sakaki pressed the man's face into the ground, and he kept insisting that he hadn't killed anyone. He claimed he was hired for a job and nothing more. He had never done anything criminal. Hearing this, the officer grew anxious and couldn't believe his ears. He pressed the man's face even harder and, despite everything, tried to find out who that woman was. It was clear that the case had just become much more complicated. Meanwhile, the scene shifted back to the university where the girl turned around and saw the figure of a woman behind her. But after a moment, she recognized the woman as Aoyama. She was quite cheerful and smiling, so she raised no suspicions. Immediately, she began asking about the beauty contest, saying she hadn't seen her since those days. Moreover, Matsui was well aware of what had happened to her friends, the other contestants, and she couldn't believe what was going on. The woman didn't deny the horrific crime that had occurred, but there was no sympathy or regret on her face. It was clear that the 3 girls were close friends, having bonded during the contest. Yet the woman continued to act very positively and didn't stop smiling. It seemed she was completely unconcerned about the problems. Suddenly, she invited the girl over for a cup of tea, which felt quite strange and unexpected. Was this woman planning a surprise? Meanwhile, outside, it was getting dark, and everyone had long been home. Aoyama was also heading home. Singing to herself, she entered her house. Surprisingly, despite all the horrific events that had happened the day before, her mood was exceptionally good. Once inside, she kept singing and headed towards some obscure room. The first thing she did was open a window in the room, likely for ventilation. Then she began preparing and setting up some mysterious item. With each passing minute, her mood lifted and the smile on her face grew wider and brighter. Suddenly, upon opening the bathroom door, it became clear that the same girl from the street was lying inside, already unconscious. After a while, the scene shifted to the city hospital. In the hospital room lay the recently suspected Shigeyama. Due to severe injuries, he needed medical assistance. The investigators, who were already in the room with the man, continued to question him about the unknown woman who was his employer. The man, in an emotional state, kept repeating that he knew nothing and was only doing what the woman told him. He was just doing his job and had no intention of killing anyone. The only thing he did was kidnap Tagawa Haruka, who then became the new victim. However, the men weren't in a hurry to believe his words and planned to check his phone and other personal belongings for evidence of his involvement. Suddenly, Tamaki burst into the hospital. She wanted to deliver an important warning to the director. She said they hadn't been able to locate the winner of the beauty contest as she hadn't returned home. This news shook all the men, and they realized that another murder was likely about to happen. Therefore, without wasting any time, the director ordered everyone to prepare and immediately head to the area to check everything for any evidence. But that wasn't all the news. The fact was that, on the same site as last time, a stream had begun. The title of the stream spoke for itself, and it became clear that another murder was being prepared. The director and Oi looked very concerned, as this only meant they hadn't managed to save the 3rd girl. The only hope was that the technician had managed to trace the user and thus pinpoint his location. However, the site belonged to an American company, and a request had been sent about the user, but it seemed the user had concealed it with a fake IP address, which would be very difficult to trace. The director looked shattered, realizing that hope was gone. He found Sakaki and addressed him. He said desperate times called for desperate measures. So, for reasons unclear, he ordered the young man to follow him. It seemed the director had a plan that no one knew about, and now was the moment to put it into action. It was deep into the night in the city, but you could still see people out on the streets, either strolling or heading home. However, police were active around the university and nearby areas. They were stopping cars and questioning people in hopes of finding any evidence or connection to the crime. It was so serious that people were being stopped right in the middle of the street and bombarded with a barrage of confusing questions, trying to establish their involvement or find the culprit. Meanwhile, the director and his partner arrived at a massive building. It became clear that this was a highly confidential matter, as they had come here alone. Sakaki understood that a great responsibility rested on his shoulders since the director had chosen him out of all the department staff to accompany him. However, the place didn't resemble a police station at all. It was quite bright and well decorated inside. The men walked through the entire building and stopped in front of a door in a large corridor. But Sakaki couldn't grasp the true reason for their visit and kept asking the director questions, trying to make sense of it all. At that moment, the director replied that their visit could be considered an illegal investigation. A strange smile appeared on his face, and as they entered, they found themselves in a room filled with numerous doors. In the center stood a massive chair surrounded by a multitude of monitors and equipment, and someone was sitting inside. The person there remained completely calm and didn't react to their entrance. The guy in the room looked like a hacker and had a serious demeanor. After a moment, he began to rise from his chair and walked directly toward the law enforcement officers. Standing before them, it was clear he was wearing a fluffy pajama set and looked rather comical. Seeing him, Sakaki couldn't understand how this teenager could possibly help them, let alone what illegal things he could do. He thought they were facing an ordinary clown pretending to be someone smart. However, the director remained calm, seemingly confident that the kid could assist them. He firmly stated that he had business with him and was counting on his support. Meanwhile, events shifted to Aoyama's apartment where a new potential victim of a terrifying maniac was being held. On the floor near the bathtub lay torture tools, including various sharpened knives and saws. At that moment, the girl began to wake up. She struggled to regain her senses and understand where she truly was when suddenly something incomprehensible poured over her head. Matsui was terrified but quickly realized it was just wine. Aoyama, standing next to the girl, continued to pour wine and, smiling, asked if she had slept well and how she felt. Immediately, upon seeing the woman, the poor victim tried to hide deeper in the bathtub to protect herself. She couldn't believe her eyes and couldn't understand how her acquaintance could treat her this way and why she was doing it. Trying to free herself and escape, she was horrified to discover her hands were tied. At that moment, she began to grasp the gravity of her situation and that her life was in jeopardy. However, she still couldn't comprehend Aoyama's actions and what her motives were. It seemed the woman derived pleasure from seeing her victim scared and in such a dire situation as her smile grew wider with every passing second. The frightened girl attempted to call for help, but it was clear to everyone that no one would hear her or come to her rescue. To calm her own victim, the woman pulled out a knife and threatened her with dire consequences if she didn't shut up. The terrified girl had no choice but to comply and stop screaming. She understood she was doomed and tried to convince Aoyama not to harm her. She pleaded with Aoyama to let her go, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong and was innocent. However, her words had no effect, and the sick sadist was determined to carry out her horrific plan. Matsui realized that everything could end for her at that very moment, and there was no way to save herself. Suddenly, the woman stopped and, smiling, began to stare intently at her victim's face. Then, unexpectedly, she leaned in close to the girl and started shouting at her, accusing and insulting her. The girl was completely taken aback by this behavior, which frightened her even more. Aoyama couldn't calm down but tried to keep herself composed and managed to smile. Still, after a while, the sadist began to smile again, and it became clear that the time had come. The girl realized that now it was definitely all over for her, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the corridor door opened, revealing an exit from the room. Unexpectedly, Aoyama helped her victim out of the bathtub and headed with her to another place. It seemed everything had passed and the girl had a little more time or even a chance to survive. However, things were much more complicated than they appeared and the woman had no intention of letting the girl go free. As they walked behind her, she kept the knife raised, ready to stab her in the back at any moment if the girl tried to escape. Moreover, she constantly repeated that the girl couldn't run away or she would simply slit her throat. But Matsui didn't speak to her. She was terrified and was only hoping for a miracle. After a while, the girls approached the elevator, but to their great disappointment, they weren't planning to use it. Instead, they intended to take the stairs and ascend that way. The issue was that there was a camera in the elevator that could help the girl escape and expose the sadist. Just at that moment, as the girls passed by the elevator, Its doors began to open with a familiar sound. It was obvious that someone had arrived on their floor and was about to step out. The women barely had time to hide when the elevator doors opened, and at that moment the girl's eyes lit up as she saw her last chance. A man stepped out of the elevator, returning from work. However, he kept a close watch on the women, not taking his eyes off them. He scrutinized their faces so intently that it seemed he suspected something was off. For the girl, this meant hope, and she tried to signal in every way possible to show how dire her situation was, and that only he could help her. Aoyama, on the other hand, tried to appear cheerful and didn't draw attention to herself. At that moment, she greeted the man, and he responded in kind. Poor Matsui was terrified, as this only meant she had lost her chance for salvation. It seemed the man had no more suspicions and continued on his way. However, curiosity got the better of him, and at the last moment, he decided to turn back and look at the women. For that, he even had to stop. It seemed he really noticed something was off, but he couldn't grasp the true reason or how to help. The girl again clung to her futile hopes, believing that man could save her. And Aoyama, who also understood that the man was doubtful and how close she was to failing, tried to smile even wider, her grin stretching with renewed vigor. Uncertain, they moved on, and the girl's hope began to fade gradually. She couldn't believe that perhaps those moments could be her last. Meanwhile, the man continued to stand there, watching the women leave, but he didn't dare stop them or say anything. For Aoyama, the threat was still present, and she remained tense, anticipating that her victim might start to struggle or scream. Therefore, she pressed the knife harder against the girl's body, ready to stab her at any moment. Suddenly, the man spoke, but he mentioned that the rope in the woman's bag might have fallen out. Indeed, the rope was not very well hidden, and that alone could reveal everything. However, Aoyama was very cautious. She thanked the man and began to carefully hide it back. He, in turn, simply thanked her and was about to leave. Just then, Matsui couldn't hold back any longer and decided to take drastic measures, so she shouted to the man for help. But her desire to live was cut short when Aoyama thrust the knife into her back with such force that a bloodstain appeared on her clothing. Overcoming incredible pain, the girl barely managed to stay on her feet and forced herself to be quiet. She had no choice, her hands were tied and she could hardly resist, so she headed toward the stairs. Aoyama pressed so close to the girl that she could feel her breath. Immediately, they went to the stairs and quickly locked the door behind them. The confused man couldn't understand what had just happened and stood there for a long time, staring into the dim corridor. He was utterly bewildered, having never seen anything like it. The only conclusion he could draw from what had happened was that the second girl was quite cute and he liked her. Meanwhile, the women began to ascend the stairs. They were quite high up and soon emerged onto the roof of the building. Once at the top, the brave girl realized there was nowhere to run, as the building was one of the tallest in the city. In front of her, she saw a terrifying bag with gardening tools, the same ones that had been in the bathroom. However, she couldn't believe that the woman could treat her so cruelly, as she hadn't done anything wrong to anyone. She believed it could all end and she would go home, that it would all turn out to be just a prank. Aoyama, on the other hand, was thrilled that she had finally reached her third victim and was about to carry out a brutal act against her. Aoyama remarked that the girl's most beautiful attribute was her face, as she was very pretty. However, the victim couldn't understand anything and just watched in shock as events unfolded. The killer also mentioned that her face was very small and delicate, which played a significant role. But the girl couldn't understand why it was necessary to talk about her face at that moment. Perhaps it was some hidden trick to distract her? Yet they continued to walk, and with every step, she approached the edge of the building when suddenly, Aoyama told her not to move. She warned that the girl absolutely couldn't move or she risked being killed right there on the spot. To lend weight to her words, she began to stab the girl in the back with her own knife, causing her immense pain and bleeding. However, the killer didn't listen. Instead, she continued to talk about how long she had thought about how to kill the girl and destroy her lovely face. Hearing this, the girl began to cry and turned to her captor. She realized that these were truly her last moments, as her life could end very soon. However, there was one interesting detail below that the girl seemed to have missed. It was a camera, and she had no idea she had become the new victim of a live broadcast, and a new tragedy was about to unfold. The stream had already begun on the website, and instead of a caption, an image of the very building appeared. It became clear what the killer's true plan was. She intended to throw the girl from a great height. The camera was set up so that viewers could see the moment of impact. At that moment, Aoyama grabbed the girl by the hair and prepared to try to throw her off the edge. However, the girl began to resist, and a real life-and-death struggle ensued between the women. Matsui was very young and didn't want to die at all, so she decided to fight for her life by any means necessary. She understood that the struggle was uneven and soon she surrendered. Her strength was depleted, and she found herself at the edge of the building. The sadist held her by the hair and pushed her head right over the edge, so she was practically at the brink. She held her victim by the hair, and it was entirely up to her how much longer the girl would live. It became clear that Aoyama envied the girl as she was a beauty pageant winner and had received an honorable award. Meanwhile, her dream of winning such a tournament remained unfulfilled. But Matsui tried to explain that the contest was just an event at the university and no one cared about it. However, the woman thought otherwise, and the girl's words struck her deep in her soul. For her, it held immense significance, and she wished nothing but death for her. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Sakaki appeared, which was a true salvation for the unfortunate girl. He understood that time was running out and action needed to be swift and decisive. So, without a moment's hesitation, he pushed the killer away from her victim with all his might. The blow was so strong that blood appeared on her face and body, and she was sent flying several meters away. Unable to get up, Aoyama remained on the ground. Without hesitation and wasting no time, the officer headed toward the killer. He immediately grabbed her by the arm. With a swift motion, he cuffed her, thwarting all her plans and rendering her effectively incapacitated. He understood that even a minute's delay could have resulted in one more victim. Aoyama was suspected and arrested for attempted murder. Now she wasn't smiling. She just lay silently on the ground, watching the officer's actions without trying to resist. And the poor girl, who had already been saying goodbye to life, couldn't believe what had just happened. Aoyama was deeply disappointed, as her plans had been ruined at the very last moment. Meanwhile, inside the building, Shige was on the phone. It became clear that he was aware that the victim had been saved and the criminal had been found, and he was preparing to move into position. So, without delay, he began to ascend to the roof of that very building. The director, who had also been following all the events, understood that they had made it and could win. He had been in the office with the strange hacker the whole time, thanking him for his help. It was odd that, after all this time, the kid hadn't lost his potential and had once been the head of the cybersecurity ministry. However, the hacker remained calm and didn't react to the words of gratitude. It seemed this was just an everyday occurrence for him, and he justified it by saying he loved to work. Sakaki turned to the tearful girl and asked her to get back on her feet. He couldn't let the criminal go, so he asked if the girl was okay and if she could walk on her own. He received an affirmative response and realized she hadn't been tortured and was all right. Suddenly, Aoyama began to smile and shook her head vigorously. This frightened Sakaki as he sensed danger approaching him. Suddenly, he felt a sharp and intense pain piercing through his entire body. The thing was, an unknown assailant had unexpectedly attacked him, plunging a knife deep into his back with incredible force and aggression. She didn't let go of the knife, waiting for the man to fall to the ground and release her partner himself. But Sakaki continued to endure, unable to comprehend what had really happened and how the girl had managed to sneak up on him. Meanwhile, she pressed the knife even harder into the man's back. Blood gushed from his wounded back, spilling everywhere around them. Suddenly, Shige stepped onto the roof, witnessing the horrific events unfold. He realized that his partner had been injured and tried to shout to him, but there was nothing more he could do to help. At that moment, hearing the words of another officer and realizing that he might open fire, the unknown woman decided it was time to flee, so she pulled out the knife. Sakaki felt a chill wash over him, and touching the wound, he horrifiedly understood that he had been seriously injured, with blood pooling on his hand. Suddenly, he began to experience strange hallucinations where he could hear sounds and understand everything perfectly. He was taken deep into his childhood, where he was just a little boy. He saw himself hiding from his father, terrified of him. He also remembered his mother, who was badly beaten and tied up, lying on the ground. He regularly witnessed domestic violence and saw how much his mother suffered. But he could only hide and cry bitterly, unable to help her, fearing he might end up like her. Moreover, he couldn't physically stand up to his father as he was much smaller and weaker. For years, he lived in fear and constant tension, witnessing ongoing beatings and arguments. He felt an incredible amount of pity for his mother, whom he loved deeply. He also realized that his mother was the only woman who inspired and motivated him, and he knew he loved her the most. The boy constantly blamed himself for not being able to help her. He hated his father and vowed to take revenge on him in the future. After these horrifying memories, the boy began to return to reality, realizing where he actually was. Shige understood that Sakaki was in serious trouble, so he rushed to help him. But the boy managed to gather all his willpower. He couldn't let another woman suffer like his mother, so he knocked his partner to the ground. He managed to restrain the unknown woman and pinned her head to the ground. Having done this, he waited for his partner to help him put handcuffs on her. They succeeded in arresting her. Once they had her handcuffed, they prepared to take her to the police station. The girl was also suspected of attempted murder, after which the officer tried to find out her name. Suddenly, Aoyama, who had been standing quietly, suddenly ran off. It seemed she was trying to escape to avoid responsibility. However, at the last moment, the man noticed and anticipated this, so they were ready for it. Moreover, Matsui also began to scream, trying to alert her rescuers about the fleeing woman. To everyone's surprise, Aoyama stopped at the edge of the building. Although she had nowhere to run, her intentions remained unclear, and it was uncertain what she was waiting for. In the end, everything became clear. People realized with horror what was about to happen, and they learned the unknown woman's name. Mikarin. The police tried to negotiate with the woman, but she was resolute. They even resorted to persuasion, as it was clear that the live broadcast was still ongoing, and panic could erupt in the city. Sakaki looked extremely tired and worn out. His wound hurt and he had no strength for any persuasion, but he remained observant and ready for anything. Aoyama was furious and began to scream, trying to explain that she had no choice and should have died long ago. But now she was happy that she could finally be free and end all her suffering. Mikarin understood that her partner was preparing to jump, and a look of horror froze on her face. She could do nothing, while the crazy woman seemed delighted that she could finally just die. Sakaki realized this was the end and the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the woman pushed off the edge of the building and began to fall. The height was so great that she had no chance, and Mikarin, who was ready to sacrifice herself for her rescue, began to scream and cry. The boy couldn't allow new victims to appear even though the woman was a murderer. Moreover, they were planning to interrogate her and wanted to find important information and answers to their questions. However, this became impossible as she could not be saved. Furthermore, no one would face severe punishment for all the murders and crimes. Meanwhile, the live broadcast, which had been running continuously, was about to show the horrific consequences of an equally horrific act. Hundreds of people witnessed the woman fall to her death from a terrifying height. A pool of blood spread across the ground, and it was unclear when all of this would end. In the end, the woman crashed and her lifeless body lay in the middle of the sidewalk. Never before had any of the men witnessed such an act of suicide, especially one so brazen. They realized they had lost a potential criminal and hadn't managed to extract any important information from her. Moreover, no one would be held accountable for Matsui's suffering, and the real motives behind the crime could only be guessed at. Mikarin couldn't simply survive her friend's death and cried bitterly, but she understood that there was no way to turn back. People continued to stand at the edge of the building, staring into the abyss beneath their feet. They tried to assess the force with which the woman hit the ground, but it was clear she had no chance of survival. So, they had to come to terms with her death and try to cope with these horrific events. Additionally, they had another suspect from whom they could extract important information. There was also hope that she might know something about past murders and future attempts. Meanwhile, dawn was breaking in the city. The new day brought a glimmer of hope to the city, as the person involved in the series of horrific murders had been neutralized. People strolled through the park, peacefully living their lives, appearing calm and cheerful. But Sakaki, as always, was very calm and contemplative. He constantly thought about the events that had happened to him the day before. He silently watched a woman with a baby who was peacefully walking through the park across from him. He was so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he didn't even react when the child fell and started crying. It seemed he was completely cold-blooded and indifferent to any problems that didn't directly concern him. Suddenly, he heard his name, which meant someone recognized him. It was Aoi, who happened to be passing by and recognized his colleague. It seemed Sakaki hadn't expected to run into any of his colleagues here, so he was a bit surprised to see the guy in front of him. Aoi, for his part, was aware of the recent events and what had happened, so he asked how Sakaki was feeling and whether his wounds had healed. However, not much time had passed since that terrible night, and it was clear that his wounds still hurt and were a constant reminder. In fact, this was good news, as the man felt much better and didn't experience as much pain as in the first days after the injury. Moreover, from their conversation, it became clear that after the arrest of the unknown girl, things at their police station had taken a turn for the worse. It seemed this was the reason for Sakiki's bad mood, as he took his work very seriously and took all the failures that happened to him to heart. It became evident that he blamed himself for not capturing the main criminal and allowing her to die. Therefore, he was convinced that he had relaxed and made a big mistake, even though he had saved Matsui's life. Meanwhile, events shifted to the main office where all the police officers gathered again. They tried to collect and structure information to learn more about potential suspects involved in the crimes that had shaken the city. After reading a lot of information from old local newspapers, they found an interesting connection. It became clear that Aoyama, who was the main suspect in all the crimes, had also participated in the same beauty pageant as her victims. And a man named Shigeyama was her assistant for a huge reward, whom she had found online. It also became clear that this man was involved in abducting the victims and helped transport them at night. He had already given testimony regarding his involvement in the kidnapping of one of the girls who was killed at the factory. And this only meant that people were living in a terrifying time, a time when even crimes could be planned online and carried out live. Moreover, witnesses to the horrific events could be completely random people who didn't even understand where they had ended up. The investigators also managed to find traces of blood belonging to Wajima Reiko. And most interestingly, they were found at the scene of the last crime, specifically in Aoyama's apartment. This could only mean that the girl had also been tortured in that very apartment before being moved to another location where she died. Additionally, the police had a lot of information about the criminal, specifically that she dreamed of becoming a doctor and didn't even attend the trial round of the beauty pageant. From this information, it could be concluded that she was evil and resentful, and in this way she sought revenge on other beautiful girls. However, these were just guesses and the woman herself could never confirm their words. But most likely it was all true. The woman was constantly in a healthy state and behaved quite suspiciously and unwell. After all, when a person feels a disruption of social norms for some reason, they can become obsessed with any idea. Anxiety and disappointment, along with an unfulfilled idea, can break a personality and lead them to commit a crime or suicide. Some of the police officers were hearing such terms for the first time. But in reality, this anomaly had been known for a long time and was long ago written about by the unknown sociologist Durkheim. Another scholar who also studied the anomaly developed this idea and established that a situation where there is a disbalance between a person's goals and their ability to achieve those goals leads to the anomaly itself. In fact, the problem was much deeper and more serious than it seemed at first glance. After all, it related to criminal behavior that developed through a situation where there was a certain goal, but the individual had no real methods to achieve it. After a brief lecture, the other police officers understood almost nothing. However, Karasuma intended to explain everything in detail once more and go through it step by step. So, he repeated the approximate behavior of the woman at the moment she was preparing for the murder. After that little scene and improvisation, everything became clear and the motive for the crime was clarified. Moreover, the other police officers agreed with their colleagues' words as the reasoning turned out to be quite logical. But the question regarding her accomplice remained open, and no one could yet understand the motives of that girl. During the search of her residence, nothing was found and her interrogation was still ongoing despite the fact that the girl was not considered involved in the murder and denied any responsibility. The woman did not deny it and directly stated that Aoyama's behavior had been quite strange lately, but at the same time assured that she herself knew nothing about the murders. She called the murderer that same evening but received no response, after which she decided to go to her house. From her words, it became clear that she had accidentally stabbed the police officer with a knife, and she described her actions as impulsive and thoughtless. It seemed there was no more information, but one important detail remained. The fact is that the two women had met. Upon hearing this news, the men were surprised as no one had expected this, especially Shige, who hadn't considered such a possibility and only thought about it at that moment. But the director was convinced that the woman's involvement could not be completely ruled out and she could somehow be connected to all the murders. It was worth continuing to dig and search for information to uncover the truth. The director was convinced that if they had managed to save the criminal's life, it would have significantly simplified their search, but he was glad they managed to save the victim. At that moment, he praised Sakiki once again, saying that he had done a good job. But for the boy, these words meant nothing as he still felt bad and thought that he could have done this task much better. Nevertheless, despite the work done, the workday ended and the men headed home. For them, a drink was the best way to end the day as it allowed them to relax and distract from the terrifying events that constantly haunted them. Sakaki, who was walking ahead, heard his name. He realized it was Karasuma, who seemed to want something from him. As it turned out later, he wanted to spend the evening in the company of the man and invited him for a drink. So, the boys agreed and headed to a local bar. As it became clear, Karasuma didn't drink alcohol and instead ordered a glass of green tea. This greatly angered Sakaki as he had genuinely set himself up to relax and unwind. He realized that the evening was going to be filled with boring conversations and lectures from his friend. But he denied and dismissed these suspicions, pointing at the bar counter. His attention was drawn to a wine bottle that was very expensive and exquisite. Yet Sakaki couldn't understand why it caught his attention as it seemed completely ordinary and he saw nothing special about it. But at that moment, the conversation turned to the murderer, and a new question arose. Why did she use wine for her crimes? However, the boy had no answer to this question, as only Aoyama could know, and they hadn't had the chance to talk to her. They also needed to pay attention to the last words of the woman before her suicide. After all, there was something very mysterious and unclear in her words. The boys spent some time in silence, not speaking to each other at all, when suddenly, Karasuma uttered a single word, "Libere." However, Sakaki heard that word for the first time and was very surprised as his friend spoke so confidently and it seemed he was quite knowledgeable about the topic. In ancient Rome, this was the god of fertility and there were also mentions of the god of wine. Additionally, there was a hypothesis that his other name was Libertas, which would mean a divine embodiment of freedom. But Sakaki was somewhat confused, as he had never heard of such mythology before, especially that such a god existed. However, his friend insisted that this was true and that this information was known to everyone. It could be said that Liber was the equivalent of the Greek god Dionysus. And Dionysus, in turn, was also known as the god of ritual madness. This information completely threw the man off balance and it seemed he was confused. He couldn't understand how this information could help in the investigation and establish the motive for the murder. After all, it started with the wine she poured on her victims and then her words about freedom. All of this led Karasuma to thoughts about her brother and mythology as a whole. However, Sakaki weakly believed that a god from ancient Roman mythology could somehow be connected to the murders. A discussion ensued between the men during which each tried to prove his point of view. However, the round of drinks they were served managed to calm them down for a moment and stop the confrontation. But the standoff continued with renewed vigor. Sakaki's head was already starting to hurt and he decided to remain silent and enjoy the rest of the evening. Perhaps he was missing many important details and not focusing on the little things, which made it hard for him to understand his friend. The next day, preparations were underway in the city for a major event. Hundreds, if not thousands, of tourists flocked in from different corners of the country. As a result, the streets were filled with real human traffic jams and it was easy to get lost in the crowd. The thing was, a very famous music group was set to perform in the city and fans had been eagerly waiting for this event for a long time. Everything was supposed to take place in the local park and at that moment a huge crowd was gathering near the entrance. Soon, everything was ready to kick off and the fans who had waited so long for this dream event were about to witness a truly spectacular show. The scale of the event was impressive, as the music group was indeed very well known, and their concert had been planned for ages. The fans were ecstatic, applauding and singing along to their favorite songs. Everything was perfect and no one could have imagined that soon something would happen that would change the lives of countless people forever. It was deep into the night, but the concert continued and people kept celebrating. The atmosphere was fantastic, and many were soaking in the moment, having waited so long for this event. It only happened once a year, so the scale of it was hard to fathom. However, it seemed the concert was nearing its end and hundreds of people were getting ready to leave the stadium. Two friends, who had decided to celebrate together, began talking about a mysterious stranger. It became clear that one of the girls had been constantly harassed by an unknown man who even stalked her. However, she assured her friend that everything was fine now and she had no issues with him. The truth was, she had reported it to the police, which helped scare the guy off. But he didn't stop right away. Everything changed when the police started threatening him and even keeping an eye on him. While it was somewhat funny, it was also the plain truth and the guy could definitely be considered odd and even dangerous. Meanwhile, police officers were stationed in the central square, seemingly there to patrol the night streets and ensure there were no disturbances, especially on such a festive day. However, one of the officers was acting quite strangely, keeping his gaze fixed on one of the girls. She noticed this just as the man approached her closely. Moreover, she was shocked to see that he was holding a bottle of wine in his hand. Suddenly, stopping right in front of her, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at her. She was terrified, but couldn't process what was happening and froze in place. Then a gunshot rang out and the whole city seemed to shudder. The poor girl was still alive after the shot, but the man didn't want her to survive, so he kept firing. He looked incredibly angry, his eyes nearly bulging out of their sockets. The guy was completely unhinged and was about to use that wine for something sinister. After uncorking another bottle, he raised it over the girl's body and began pouring it on her. It turned out he was taking revenge for her not wanting to be with him. The lifeless girl lay on the sidewalk, drenched in wine. Witnesses of this horrific incident saw the terror unfold right in the heart of the city on a day of great celebration. This event changed everyone forever, and it became clear that evil had taken root in the darkest and most secret corners of the city.